Have you ever noticed how a really good story can, like, hit you in the gut? Like, even harder than something you'd see on the news?
Yeah, sometimes fiction can get at these truths that, like, regular reporting just misses.
Well, that's exactly what we're going to unpack today in this deep dive. We've got this amazing transcript, right? This conversation between Trevor Noah, from The Daily Show, and Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. She's a brilliant novelist, really insightful.
Definitely. Her books are phenomenal. And getting to hear her thoughts with Trevor's questions guiding things, it's a really unique perspective on it. Well, on a lot, actually.
Oh, for sure. We're talking about how being famous affects artists, the way American culture works, especially in those like super intellectual circles, and even how we all deal with this crazy polarized world we're living in. I think there's a lot in this conversation that'll make you go, whoa, never thought of it that way.
Right. So what we're going to do is pull out those key insights, kind of like a cheat sheet to Edichie's ideas and how they connect to these bigger cultural things we're all swimming in, right?
Okay, so let's dive in. One of the first things that jumped out at me was Adichie's take on fame. She makes this point that fame itself doesn't ruin art, but it changes how we see it. What do you think of that?
It's fascinating how she separates the actual creation from the public reaction. Like, there's that analogy Noah uses about stand-up comedy, right? He says, once a comedian hits a certain level of fame, the audience isn't just judging the jokes anymore. They're judging the person telling them.
Yeah, it's like imagine a brand new comic, right, telling a joke about like the grocery store. It's relatable, but if it's Jerry Seinfeld saying the exact same joke, people are looking for some hidden meaning. They tie it into his whole persona.
Exactly. The material hasn't changed, but our perception of it has, just because of who's delivering it. And that leads to this gravitas thing that famous artists get. Noah mentions Picasso's napkin sketches, supposedly. A doodle by Picasso is like genius. An unknown artist does the same thing. Nobody cares.
It really makes you think how much of what we call good art is actually just being influenced by like the name attached to it. For you listening out there, think about it. When you look at art, are you truly seeing the art or are you seeing the artist's reputation?
Right. And then Adichie brings it back to her own experience, which I thought was really interesting. She says when she's writing her fiction, the whole idea of fame just vanishes. It's not even in her head. She calls that creative space sacrosanct. And only when she's editing does she even think about an audience. And even then, she says she almost never changes anything based on that.
Wow, that says a lot about her process. Like the story has its own truth, and she's got to stay true to that. It makes you think for anything you're working on, whether it's art or, I don't know, a big project at work. How do you keep that core creative part safe from all the outside pressures?
Yeah. And then there's this hilarious story she tells about like people coming up to her saying they love her books, but they haven't read any of them.
Oh, I love that. And her response is so Adichie, so Nigerian, straight to the point.
She just asks, which one's your favorite? Boom. Calls them out right there. And of course, they can't name a single book. So, it shows how fame can be so superficial. For you out there, it's like, are you really into something? Or do you just like the idea of being into it?
Let's move on to something that's always super interesting when it comes to novelists, the whole fiction versus reality thing. Her latest book, Commune Count, is set during COVID. Was the pandemic like the main focus of the book? Or
Not exactly. She talks about how COVID and the lockdown created a specific kind of mood. It gave her main character this space to think, be nostalgic. But the novel's really about love dreams, this like melancholy longing and learning to live with uncertainty. So COVID's there, but it's more like the background for the character's journey.
And she writes it in such a personal way that Trevor actually thought it was a memoir at first. Like, it blurred the lines for him. It makes me wonder, have you, the listener, ever read a story that felt so real? It was like you were living it.
And that gets us to the question of how intentional she's being with, social commentary. Like, she writes about wealthy Africans and the whole vibe within American academia. She trying to make a specific point with all that?
Her answer surprised me. She said she mainly writes about stuff that really interests her, things she knows well. She's got to keep it authentic. So the story itself comes first, not some message she's trying to push.
But she did say that some parts of Dream Count, especially those scenes in universities, are kind of satirical. It's like she's holding up this funhouse mirror to that world, but it's still rooted in her own experiences. So for you out there, think about this. Can a story be Super personal and a critique of society at the same time.
So even though it's fiction, it can still open our eyes to real-world issues, and Adichie believes that a good novel can actually help us understand why people do the things they do. Maybe even better than news articles or like political debates.
Yeah, she's really into how fiction can get at the messy emotional side of being human in a way that other forms of communication just don't. So maybe this is a reminder for all of us. Stories have this power to build empathy. They can help us understand people who are different from us.
Okay, let's listen to the social commentary part more specifically. One character in Dream Count was based on Nafissatou Diallo and the whole Dominique Strauss-Kahn case, from back in 2011. It's clear that case really affected Adichie.
Absolutely. She talks about being so angry, so hurt by how everything went down. And it made her write that powerful essay focusing on what it means for sexual assault survivors and how society expects them to be these perfect victims, which is, just not realistic.
Yeah, she brings up specific things that got to her, like the perp walk, how the charges were dropped because of problems with Diallo's asylum application, which had nothing to do with the actual assault, and how the defense kept calling her a liar.
And you can tie this back to a lot of what Adichie writes about. Power imbalances, how some people are denied justice. She even said this case wounded her African spirit. Like, it messed with her sense of fairness, her belief in basic human rights.
And then there's that line in the book, Super Powerful, where someone says, "In America, money is justice." She talked about that, how it's tied to culture's ideas about justice. She even used the example of a village in South Africa where, but if you do something wrong, you might get corporal punishment instead of jail time. Totally different way of thinking about accountability, right? So for our listeners, what does your culture truly value when it comes to justice?
Yeah, that money is justice line. It makes you think about how wealth affects legal outcomes in America. Like, is justice truly blind? The South African village example just highlights how different our ideas of justice can be.
Dream Count also takes a pretty hard look at American liberal academia. Adichie has this Nigerian character who comes in with certain expectations and he gets like totally disillusioned by what she encounters.
And Adichie talks about this feeling that academia today is missing some beautiful things. She feels there's a lack of compassion, empathy, and she contrasts that with her own experiences in Nigerian universities when she was younger. Makes you wonder, what's changed? Why is it different now?
And she's honest about how hard it is to have open discussions in universities these days. There's this self-censorship, right? You're afraid to say the wrong thing or even agree with someone who's considered an enemy in this like super divided world we in.
It's striking that she sees that too, right? Someone who values intellectual spaces. Makes you think, if you've spent time in universities or even just in any group where there's pressure to conform, does this ring true for you?
This all flows into this big, messy problem. How do we handle polarization? One thing they discussed was how political disagreements in the US are so much more intense, more personal than in Nigeria or other parts of Africa. Like over there, you can have huge arguments and still stay friends.
Adichie called it the moralizing of opinion in America. It's not just, I disagree with you on policy X, it's, you're a bad person for believing that. And that shuts down any chance of actually talking it out, finding common ground.
For sure. And they talked about how social media and the way politicians talk, right, just makes everything worse. They even compared it to pro wrestling, how it's all performance.
Yeah, like maybe some of these politicians who are yelling at each other in public are totally fine behind closed doors. It makes you think how much of what we see is just for show. But Adichie also said it's important to take responsibility for how we act in these divided times. And she's not into making big generalizations about entire groups of people, just because of their politics.
Right. It's complicated, especially when it feels like basic human rights are on the line. They got into this and she used school choice as an example. Like even a simple idea like that can be so loaded politically, people interpret it in completely different ways.
Which brings up this question. Do you ever find yourself like instantly judging an idea because of where you think it fits in politically?
And they kept coming back to this idea that we've lost some loving curiosity. Like people are less and less comfortable just asking questions, especially in those academic settings. And they were worried about how money from donors might be affecting universities, maybe preventing them from having truly open, challenging discussions. Makes you wonder, where else do you see this happening, outside of universities? Are there other places where the need to please donors is stifling free speech?
For sure. It's a big concern. These institutions should be where we can freely explore ideas, even ones that go against the grain. And it makes you wonder, what can we do to protect those spaces?
Switching gears a bit, let's talk about personal integrity. Edishi made this very deliberate choice to stay off social media. She calls it self-preservation.
Right, she knows how easy it is to get sucked into online fights, and she just, like, opted out. To protect her mental space, focus on her writing. It makes you think about your own relationship with social media, right? Is it helping you or draining you?
And she talked about needing radical honesty in her fiction. Like, she can't hold anything back. She truly believes literature can explore those dark, messy parts of being human that we don't always talk about.
It's like in her novels, she gets to be completely truthful about everything. And that's where she feels like she's fulfilling her purpose as an artist, exploring all the good and bad stuff that makes us human.
Interesting. What about criticism? How does she deal with that?
She's very clear. Other people's opinions don't sway her easily. What matters is thinking for yourself, having your own ideas based on knowledge and facts.
So it's not about winning popularity contests.
Nope, she's into good conversations, respectful debates, but she doesn't put up with disrespect or bad faith arguments. It's a good reminder to all of us. Form your own opinions. Don't just go along with what's popular.
There's this metaphor she uses. She doesn't need to compete for love. She knows what she believes in, even if not everyone agrees.
It's about that inner confidence, knowing your worth doesn't depend on everyone liking you. Powerful stuff.
Okay, last big topic, global perspective. Adichie mentions how America sometimes acts like it's the only place that matters.
And Noah tells this story about accents, how Americans might make fun of someone's accent without realizing it means they speak another language. It's subtle, but it shows that limited worldview, right? So for all of us, remember there are other ways of seeing the world. Don't assume your way is the only way.
They also talked about gay marriage and how views on that have changed in America, but it's still very different in other places, like the UAE. Noah said it's important to understand the context of other cultures, the timeline of their social progress. Don't just judge them based on where America is right now.
Exactly. It's about realizing that progress isn't a straight line, you know? Different cultures are on different paths.
And Trevor told a story about how his team at The Daily Show handled the Jussie Smollett case. Remember that whole thing? They were very careful, took their time, gathered information before saying anything definitive. They didn't want to rush to judgment.
It's a clear example of responsible journalism. Think before you speak, especially when it comes to big, complex issues. It's a lesson for everyone, right? How do we process information? How do we make sure we're not just reacting emotionally?
But Alici brought up a really good point, too. Like, is it always fair to expect everyone to be totally informed about everything, especially with all the fake news out there and just the sheer amount of information we have to wade through? Plus, trust in institutions has eroded. She used the CDC and the early mask guidance as an example.
Yeah, if you can't even trust the experts, it's tough to know what's real, and it's hard to form solid opinions when you're not even sure what's true.
So we've covered a lot. The weird relationship between fiction and the real world, how fame twists things, Adichie's insights on American culture and universities, all the polarization stuff, and the importance of thinking for yourself, having that global view.
Adichie's ideas are always challenging us, right? Making us see things from different angles. And that's so important in these times, you know?
So here's one last thing for you to think about. Do you actively seek out different viewpoints? Or do you mostly stick to what you already know? What cave are you in, to use Trevor's term? And what would it take for you to, poke your head out and see what else is out there? We encourage you to really sit with this conversation and maybe check out some of Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie's work. She's an incredible writer.